Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to have you joining us tonight. As you all enter this space, I will welcome you and say good evening. My name is Ruth Griffith. Thank you for joining Snow Isle Libraries for All the Rage, How American Politics Boiled Over, presented by Dr. Stephen Steer. We would like to begin by acknowledging that we present this program from the traditional lands of the Coast Salish peoples who have stewarded this land for generations. Next, some housekeeping. Your mics are muted. Use chat to ask questions, and we will use chat on our end to share links to any lists and websites mentioned today. After Dr. Steer's presentation, we'll have time for questions, and you're welcome to submit your questions in chat at any time, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. If you'd like to turn on captions for this event, we'll drop the instructions in the chat box. This event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel with captions in a week or two. And now, a word from our sponsors. The presentation you're about to enjoy is part of Humanities Washington's Speakers Bureau program. Humanities Washington is a nonprofit organization dedicated to sparking conversation and critical thinking, and it provides many other cultural programs to hundreds of thousands of people throughout Washington each year. Thanks to support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Washington Secretary of State, the Thomas S. Foley Institute for Public Policy and Public Service at Washington State University, and generous private donors, Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau presenters visit all corners of the state. I would encourage you to visit their website, www.humanities.org, to find other events like this one. And an important note on civil discourse. The Speakers Bureau program is designed to generate an open and honest conversation on many topics, some of which may be controversial. We encourage differing points of view, and we ask that you treat this topic, the speaker, and each other with respect. All right, finally, let's introduce tonight's speaker. Stephen Steer is the Sam Reed Distinguished Professor in Civic Education and Public Civility at the Washington State University. He earned his PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. His work has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the National Research Council, National Academy of Science, and the Century Foundation. Dr. Steer lives in Moscow, Idaho. Welcome, Dr. Steer. It's an honor to have you here tonight.
Thank you, Ruth. And thank you, everybody, for taking some time out of your schedule to spend some time with us. I'd like to start out by telling you that for the next 35 minutes or so, I'm going to tell you a story. And it's a story of how many people in America have become angry and confused and some saddened over the state of politics in the United States. For people that are listening to this of a certain age, I'm just going to be connecting the dots for life experiences that you've probably had. For younger people, I'm also going to be connecting dots, but it may be more ancient history for you. I should also say that some of the things that I'm going to describe that are going on in the United States are also going on in other Western-style democracies like Great Britain and France and Italy and Hungary and some other places that are also being rent by some of the same sorts of things that we are in this country. With that said, I'd like to okay, there we go. I'd like to point out something very important, and that is that I'm not here to indoctrinate anybody. I'm here, as I said, to connect some dots. I've been thinking about how we got to this particular place in American politics for quite a while. And so this is just my best effort at trying to explain what's going on. You may share some of these explanations, and others you may not. You may believe that there are other things that should be emphasized, but I'm not here to do anything other than try and help you kind of understand how we got here. To begin with, I think it's really important to remember that the history of the United States is full of episodes of division and tumult. And so in some sense, it's sort of baked into the cake. In fact, going all the way back to the post-revolutionary period in this country in the 1790s, which historians have called the Age of Passion. And one historian called it a decades-long shouting match. Two of the principal shouters during that period were Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, who were on opposite sides of the political spectrum. And some of the things that they were arguing about are things that we're still arguing about today. Things like immigration, trade, national security, the proper role of the federal government and state governments. And so some of these are just perennial issues that we continue to argue about. Just again, if some reminders of early political violence, there was a duel between Aaron Burr, who was a sitting vice president, and Alexander Hamilton. In the run-up to the Civil War, we saw beatings take place on the floor of the House of Representatives. We saw gunplay in the United States Senate. And of course, the shooting Civil War took place in a situation that at the time historians didn't believe that the United States could come out of that period of time tact. One of the things that academics try to do is before they launch into an explanation, they try to provide some evidence that there's really something wrong going on. And so I think there's a number of indicators suggesting that contemporary American politics is very, in some ways, dangerously dysfunctional. We're seeing levels of partisan polarization not seen since that post-Civil War period. Polarization here means a split between Democrats and Republicans in our legislative bodies. There's high levels of political incivility and nastiness in politics that we're seeing increasingly filter down into school boards and county commissioner meetings. And then there are also increasing incidences of political violence. At the national level, at least, we see policymaking reaching gridlock stages where we can't find any kind of agreement to address basic national issues. You may have read about the numbers of deaths of despair. These are deaths that are attributable to suicide, drug overdose, and alcohol. And we're seeing an increase of these deaths of despair in certain parts of the country among certain elements of our society. We have an inability to even agree on basic facts. Some people say we're living in sort of a post-truth society where alternative facts can be offered as explanations for things. Seeing widespread belief in conspiracy theories about all sorts of things related to politics and not. And of course, we also recently saw a serious attempt at overturning the election, the presidential election of 2020, based on, again, a conspiracy idea that the election was somehow stolen, even though there's no evidence that that happened in any kind of widespread way. So how did we get here? Well, like any kind of social political problem, it's complicated. And like I said, I'm going to try and connect some of the dots for you of how our government seemingly lost its mind, how hatred came to dominate our politics, and how American society is kind of unraveling. You hear a lot about populist movements and populism these days. And it's interesting to note that there's a long history of these populist movements throughout American political history on both the left and the right. And so I'd like to make a distinction, though, between left-wing populism, which features what we might call ordinary people, the middle class, against the elite establishment, the bankers and the people who are part of the elite. Whereas right-wing populism is generally generally features both that ordinary people against the elite establishment, but it also features an antipathy for outsiders, typically immigrants. And I'm going to come back to this point because I think it's an important one, particularly in our contemporary politics, where many on the extremist of the right wing believe that they're being caught between the elite above them and people who are what they believe are cutting the line and replacing them from below. I've talked to a number of historians and read a fair amount about this. Populist movements tend to thrive when American society is being destabilized. And I think part of my argument here is that over the last at least 50 to 60 years, we've been undergoing a number of stressors in our society that have destabilized the social political fabric. Many historians believe that we're sort of reliving the Gilded Age, which, if you remember from your history books, took place in that post-Civil War period and into the 1920s. And again, here's some of the features of that Gilded Age: wealth and income inequality, racial and class divisions, religious divisions, rapid technological changes, political violence, white nationalism. That was when the Ku Klux Klan arose again. The changing composition of the electorate due to immigrants. All of these things resulted in, during that time period, in partisan polarization, very close elections, and divided government. The same sorts of things that we're experiencing today. And so we're sort of a mirror in contemporary America of this period in the Gilded Age. There was also a number of conspiracy theories that were in vogue during that time period. I think the contemporary story, meaning the modern sort of story of American politics, begins at the conclusion of World War II. Clearly, the Depression of the 30s and World War II brought Americans together to fight, in the case of World War II, fascism in Europe and Japan, and that post-World War II period, which some in politics believe that it was a period of bipartisanship and civility when America was great. But there's another explanation that it might have been a period when we had an illusion of consensus. And this illusion was because the Cold War created a very strong economy. All the servicemen and women coming back supercharged the economy, and that lasted until the early 1960s. So we had strong economic growth, but it also meant that the politics was muted for civil rights, for women, for gay and other identity groups. So in some ways, by muting those alternative voices, it gave the illusion of consensus and bipartisanship. And in fact, a couple of recent articles, one in the Atlantic and one in New York Magazine, talk about this very point, that political unity can also mean that not everybody's being heard. And so there's certainly an alternative perspective on whether civility is a good thing or not. Certainly the 1960s ushered in a period of widespread political and social change. Again, like I said, some of you of a certain age will remember these things, such as I do. But the Vietnam War and marches against it in favor of civil rights, women's rights and gay rights, along with workers' rights and other rights movements became very popular. So the 60s was an era of social change where America was very divided. And then, of course, we come to the 1970s. And again, if you live through that period, you remember all the different tensions that were introduced by the Arab oil embargo, which caused an energy crisis in the United States when Arab oil producing countries decided not to produce as much oil. The Watergate scandal, and Richard Nixon, then president, was forced to resign. And importantly, he gets pardoned, which suggests that if you're connected enough and elite enough, you can get away with things. Of course, we have the defeat in Vietnam, where we finally left Vietnam in 1975. We also had a period of widespread stagflation, which economists didn't believe could happen at the same time. Stagflation was, we had both inflation and stagnant economic growth. And so economically, it wasn't a very prosperous time. And then finally, starting with Jimmy Carter, presidents from each party began embracing what we call neoliberal economic policies. So we went from Keynesian economics, which emphasizes priming the pump by making sure that consumers and the real people that drive the economy have money in their pocket through tax breaks and so forth. We moved from pump priming to trickle-down economics, which emphasizes deregulating markets, emphasizes giving tax breaks to corporations with the idea that that will then trickle down into the pockets of the workers. And like I said, it's important to remember this has been embraced, these sets of economic policies have been embraced by presidents of both parties, all the way from Jimmy Carter to Donald Trump. And so both political parties embrace these neoliberal economic views. Clearly, the rise of cable news and the 24 hours news cycle plays a role in this because it fragments our media landscape. Also, the end of the fairness doctrine, which used to require people using the public airwaves to give equal time to both sides of the political spectrum. That was ended in the 1980s. It led directly to the rise of right-wing talk radio. And so people could begin to focus only on those media stories that they already were sort of in agreement with. And then, of course, the social media platforms accelerated this fragmentation beginning in the middle of the 2000s. Newt Gingrich, I think, plays a really important role, particularly in the rise in incivility, because he embraced incivility as a political strategy, which I think a number of politicians still do today, where he came in and said that, this is the first time in 1995, that was the first time the Republican Party had been in control of the House of Representatives for 40 years. And so they got tired being pushed around, or what they thought being pushed around by the Democratic majority. And so they were eager for retribution. And so Gingrich encouraged the people as speaker to be nasty. Being neat and obedient and loyal and faithful just wasn't going to cut it anymore. And so I think he plays a big role in where we are today, particularly with political speech. Then, of course, we have the attacks of September 11th, which introduces really a new epoch in American politics, focused on national security, international terrorism, and the politics of fear, which members of both parties have used since then to push their agendas forward. A recent book about this destabilization attributable to 9/11 is Reign of Terror by Spencer Ackerman. I highly recommend it. It's a very interesting and well-written book. But one of the things that Ackerman says is that the war on terror has been driven by the perception of non-whites as marauders, even as conquerors from hostile foreign civilizations. Again, feeding this idea among a certain segment of society that they're being squeezed by the other, in this case, immigrants. And in fact, Ackerman draws a direct line between the election of Barack Obama and the war on terror. He said that united the war on terror with the culture war in the minds of some who believe Obama was a secret Muslim, another, of course, conspiracy. Of course, then we have another dramatic event, the financial crash of the 2008-2009. Economic crashes happen, although this one was avoidable in retrospect. But I think the response of the federal government is important because President Obama, newly installed, doesn't bail out the homeowners. He doesn't bail out the people who suffered down in the local communities. Instead, he showed deference to Wall Street and the market. And so, again, more evidence for some people that the elites get away with things that ordinary people just can't. Again, feeding and feeding and feeding this sort of anger and disillusionment about the role of government in our society. You can actually see the seeds of the Tea Party movement in that episode related to the economic crisis. And in fact, the Tea Party, which is still a force, maybe not by that name, but is still a force in Republican Party today, certainly was a creature of that disillusionment. Then on the left, we had Occupy Wall Street, again, a direct response to bailing out Wall Street. And then a little bit later, Black Lives Matter protests began in 2013 and of course continued throughout the decade. So I think you can see evidence on both left and right that people are angry, getting fed up with the state of the world. And although some people believe that Donald Trump came from out of nowhere, I think it's pretty easy to see that he was able to harness some of this anger, especially among a certain segment of the Republican Party, who was appealing to what I pointed out is the right-wing populism, talking about draining the swamp and the deep state. That's talking about those elites above, but also building a wall to keep out immigrants who he trumpeted that they were rapists and killers. And so he was appealing to this anger that was already, I think, present in a certain segment of society. And he portrayed himself as really as the ultimate outsider. And of course, by 2019, on the front page of the Washington Post, we see a headline that I didn't believe I would see in my lifetime. Talk turns to civil war. And so the alarm bells were sounding. Of course, Joe Biden wins the 2020 election and attempts at fomenting turn that election led on January 6th to an attack on the Capitol by Trump supporters, believing they could somehow stop the stolen or stop the steal of the election. So I think it's pretty clear that our contemporary American political life, maybe even social life, features this ongoing battle between competing belief systems. And I would even go further than just calling them belief systems of a political nature. They go right to the core of people's understandings of what culture they're a part of, what society they're a part of. And so it goes even deeper than talking about just politics. Politics generally features discussions about issues. This ongoing battle, I think, really features different versions of ways of life, different political worldviews about what the good life looks like, how to understand what's going on around us. And so it's much more deeper than just a battle over issues. How did we get so tribal? Well, part of it is identity-based conflict. We know this from political psychology. Identity-based conflict increases during stressful times. And I think there's a lot of evidence that we've been living in stressful times. And one of the other features of stress is people tend to huddle around their group. So in-group security increases, but so does out-group antipathy. What I mean by this is that people tend to look warily at out-groups like immigrants and people who don't share their same belief systems. Political scientists have a term for it. It's called affective polarization. This means you're not so much in love with your own group or party, but you really hate the other side. And a lot of studies have shown that both Democrats and Republicans don't love their party so much, they just hate the other side. And that's what's driving their views of the culture wars. Ladled on top of this, partisan leaders and the media have found conflict and incivility to be strategically useful. The media makes money over the fact that people tune in or click on stories that feature conflict. And there's a lot of studies that show this. And certainly a number of partisan leaders in Congress and elsewhere probably get along with their colleagues more than they would let on in public because they don't want their followers to believe that they're actually friends with the enemy. And so partisan leaders have also found this conflict and incivility to be useful. And then I think it's all amplified by social media, by people being able to get these messages out there faster and to a wider audience. One of the best articles that I've read, it's actually an excerpt from a book by George Packer that helps explain the different narratives that are competing in American political life these days. Is an article that appeared, like I said, in the Atlantic called How America Fractured into Four Parts. And in this article, he describes really what that there's four Americas, and he names each one and discusses what each of those Americas are composed of, who's in it, and what they believe. He starts off by talking about the group he calls Free America. These are people who we used to call country club Republicans. They have sort of a center right orientation. They emphasize freedom from regulation, individualism, small government, fiscal restraint, all the things that people like Mitt Romney would bring to the table. So they're sort of in the center right. On the center left is a group that Packer calls Smart America. These tend to be people that live in urban and suburban areas. They tend to have high levels of education. They're so-called knowledge workers, professors, lawyers, people in the tech industry. They're comfortable with globalization of the economy because of their education and their economic position. They aren't fearing the loss of their jobs to manufacturing overseas. And these folks generally have sort of a center-left orientation. Nominally the old New Deal coalition of Democrats. But then more interestingly, Packer talks about folks he calls the real America. These folks tend to be rural and predominantly white. They have lower education levels, some only high school. They overwhelmingly are evangelical Christians. They're both anti-elite and anti-immigrant, and they're very nationalistic in their viewpoints. America first. Their narrative is one of grievance and resentment. They believe they're being left behind by the elites above them and by immigrants and others below them. I would say this makes up a large part of the Make America Great Again base. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have what Packer calls Just America. These individuals tend to be urban, members of minority groups. They engage in identity politics, emphasizing gay rights, LGBTQ rights, things of that sort. They're seeking justice. And their narratives are narratives of oppression. They believe that American society for too long has kept them under their thumb, and they're demanding justice. And so I think these are the folks that populate the more far left extremist part of maybe not even the Democratic Party, but certainly of the left spectrum in American politics. It's hard to figure out precisely what percentage of Americans fall into each of these categories, but I've tried to do some back of the envelope sort of guesstimating. And I would say that this part of the population, the real America, makes up between 15 and maybe 20% of the population based on voting patterns and public opinion surveys. And I think there's about the same percentage over here in Just America. And so I would say between 30 and 40% of the population probably falls into these categories. And I think they're really driving the train when it comes to nasty politics, name calling, and things of that sort, where I think the Free America, Smart America groups are the folks that are probably the ones looking on going, what the hell's happened to our society? A number of books, some of which you could probably get at the Snow Isle libraries, have come out about these very topics. Some of them you may have read, The Politics of Resentment, Strangers in Their Own Land, kind of chronicling the phenomena on the right. Identity by Francis Fukuyama, The Plot to Change America, chronicling what's going on the left. And so there's plenty of grist for the mill. I think these culture war trends have been amplified by certain demographic and other trends that have taken place in the U.S. There's a phenomena that's been tracked for the last 15 or 20 years called the big sort. We are demographically sorting ourselves into like-minded communities. We see a big urban-rural divide, something I'm going to demonstrate here in just a minute when you look at county level presidential votes. But we tend to be sorting ourselves into like-minded political communities. Certainly income inequality and wage stagnation are playing a role in this. I think the lack of trust in government and other societal institutions is both a cause and an effect of what's going on. And then there's that intense dislike of the other parties, which I talked about before. We've seen a huge decline in public trust in whether the federal government can be trusted to do what's right most of the time from 50 or 60 years ago, when most people believed that they could trust government, to only around 20% now. It's not just government, though, that people are distrustful of. It's virtually all of our major institutions. And so when people don't know who to trust, this is when they turn, like I said, to conspiracy theories and seeking to find somebody to blame for what's going on in their lives. I talked about the big sort. Here's a series of maps that code which counties were won by landslides. And a landslide county is considered to be when one party or the other wins the popular vote by 20 or more percentage points. And you can see in 1992, relatively few landslide counties. And even going forward, where we see increasing numbers of landslide counties. Again, and I think 20% is a pretty high bar to reach when you consider electoral politics. But here's landslide counties during the last presidential election. I don't know if you realize this, but Joe Biden only won 420 counties out of the 3,000 or so counties in the United States. He just happened to win the counties that have the highest population centers. And so you can see the blue counties are where Biden won, and the red counties are where Trump won. And there are many more landslide counties in the Trump camp, but they just happen to be fairly small ones. And so they didn't add up to a popular vote win or an electoral college win. Peter Turchin has written about the cyclical nature of the instability in US politics. And he provides a nice kind of summary of some of the points I've been trying to make here. One of the things, or some of the things he talks about that induce stress in political systems are fiscal distress when it comes to government, increasing deficits and public debt, something we're talking about right now. Certainly, there's plenty of room to question government's finances. But there's also fiscal distress at the individual level. Wages have been stagnant. Income inequality and wealth inequality have increased. We're seeing a backlash against globalization and multiculturalism, particularly again on the right. Fears regarding immigration and terrorism, including domestic terrorism, are being fostered. I've talked about this distrust in societal institutions. And then put on top of all that, the public health crisis, which we still seem to be working through. Turchin created a political stress index, where he puts together some of those factors I just delineated. And he shows the beginning really in the late 70s, a period that I've been emphasizing. We've been seeing an increasing increase in political stress in the US. He recently updated the stress index to go beyond 2010, and he compared it to the same stress index he created for the Civil War. And you can see that the slope of the curves have been matching up fairly nicely. He's a pessimist when it comes to the next 10 years of American political life. He believes that stress is going to continue to get worse until at least the mid part of this decade. We also see, when we track political violence, that the increases in political violence track along with these destabilizing periods that I've talked about prior. And so, again, this sort of tracks along with the destabilization I've talked about. And finally, there was a recent poll that asked people whether they believe that political violence to achieve political goals was justified or not. And both people who identify as Democrats and as Republicans, over a third say that statement is true. So to conclude here with my portion, what does the future hold? Well, let me say to begin with, I don't like making predictions, particularly about the future, because I don't have a crystal ball, but I can conceive of several different potential scenarios. And so I'm going to talk briefly about these potential futures. One is, what's the likelihood that some institutional changes can be made to maybe tidy up around the edges? I'm thinking here about maybe having more than just two major political parties. Is there room for a third or even a fourth party in the United States? Other changes that have been talked about are making changes to the Electoral College, which encourages a bigger voice for smaller states, as does the 2 senators per state. It's pretty widely known that the 25 smallest states have the same number of senators, or the 25 smallest states have 50 senators. They have the same population as California, and California has 2 senators. And so we essentially have a non-majoritarian features of our political system. Of course, all of these changes, except for the political party situation, would require changes of the Constitution. And certainly the small states are not going to vote to dilute their influence. Will some focusing event bring the American people together? I think World War II, to some extent, the Great Depression, brought people together. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was kind of thinking maybe this is do it, but it just invigorated, I think, some of the same cleavages that we saw before. Maybe extraterrestrial aliens visiting the Earth, like a science fiction movie, would do it. Will a generational change take place? There's some evidence that what's going on in our politics is being driven by people in their 40s and 50s, and that maybe the newer generations will calm things down and be, with a more bipartisan approach to things. Remains to be seen if that can happen. I think this is the most likely way that we can break down some of the more nasty parts of our politics. And that's if voters begin punishing elective officials who stoke the fires of the culture war. If we see voters telling candidates that you better start modeling good behavior and not be so extremist, then believe me, that's going to change the behavior of people who are campaigning for office and people who get elected to office. They're very keen listeners when it comes to what the voters are willing to accept. And so I think, and we're seeing some of this modeling of good behavior, most recently, I think, in the 2020 gubernatorial election in Utah, where the Republican candidate and the Democratic candidate produced a series of joint political ads where they said, we disagree with each other on issues, but we aren't going to call each other names. And so I think that's the sort of thing that we need to see to kind of turn down the heat on American politics. Another possibility is, will problems such as maybe climate change become so pressing that our politics become issue based again, much like they were in the pre-1960s era, when we were arguing more about issues rather than who we hate and who we don't hate. And then finally, maybe the current state of affairs is just the new normal, and not going to come out of this anytime soon. And that's probably the more pessimistic of the viewpoints. In any case, thank you very much for listening to me. And if there's any questions that I can answer, I'd be happy to try.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Steer. It's been really interesting listening to your talk. I have quite a few questions that have come through the chat. Let's go ahead and start with a couple of books that have been mentioned. One listener says, have you read the book High Conflict, Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out by Amanda Ripley? And tied to that, someone said, would you include Soul of America by Meacham as clarifying or muddying the conflict you are outlining?
The second book, I don't think I'm familiar with. I do know Amanda Ripley's work, though.
Okay. Another question that came through, someone asked generally, please expand the meaning of political violence.
Should we expand the meaning?
Yeah, so I think she wanted to understand exactly what the definition of political violence was, or just expand on that a bit.
Yeah, typically, we think of shootings, bombings, things of that sort. Others would expand. They would say, there are some people who believe that political incivility is a continuum from just being nasty to somebody, being disrespectful, to political violence on the extreme, or even fostering political violence. And so I think it's useful to think of it as a continuum from murdering people to inciting people to be violent.
Thank you. It looks like there's another question here. Someone says, what efforts do you make and sources do you use to try to understand perspectives that you do not hold and perspectives other than the dominant media or academia views?
One of the nice parts of my job is I get paid to explore lots of different websites and lots of different political platforms. And so I routinely will look at a whole range. In fact, I have them bookmarked on my computer, all the way from CNBC to One America News. And so I like to make sure I expose myself to all sorts of political viewpoints and try to understand where everybody comes from. Just like everybody else, I grew up with a set of experiences, and I'm not immune to social pressures and so forth. But I also try to keep things in perspective. One of the things I was talking with you, Ruth, about at the beginning before we were even live in the webinar is I've been lucky enough to be associated with two giants of politics in Washington State. Sam Reed, three-time Secretary of State, and I'm the holder of his distinguished professorship, is a Republican. And then I was also the first director of the Foley Institute, of course, a Democratic Speaker of the House. And so I've been exposed to people, both ends of the political spectrum, that can do politics in a way that doesn't denigrate the other side, but emphasizes the differences of opinion that they have.
Thank you so much. One person mentioned that they brought up ranked voting, and that there are other parties besides the two. And do you think ranked voting would make them viable?
I haven't really studied ranked choice voting that carefully. I know some of my colleagues that have say that it does tend to reward more middle of the road candidates, particularly in primaries, because what we see in primaries is on both the Democratic side and the Republican side, the people who tend to vote in primaries tend to be the most partisan and the most, the most left of center and the most right of center. And so that encourages candidates to appeal in the primaries to those groups. And in the past, they then had to edge back towards the center. And from what I've read and heard, ranked choice voting actually encourages that sort of normalizing in the center.
Thank you so much. One question asks, could unlinking money from political process and elections be a solution?
One of I was also telling you that this slideshow can expand or contract depending on how much time I have. And in longer versions, I do talk about money in politics. And I think that certainly feeds into this whole idea that the rich can dominate our political system through donations. Now, it's more complicated than that, but certainly money plays an outsized role in our political system, and actually I think that would at least help address the perception that wealthy elites get to call the tune.
Thank you. There's so many questions coming through. I'm not sure I can keep up. One person asks, with all the buildup of conflict and pressure in the history of the United States, does it make you feel confident that we have been through these things before and we will come out okay?
Some days I'm optimistic and some days I'm pessimistic. Even though I look like I've been around for the entire history of the United States, I haven't. And so, but there's a modern society. There was another article in the Atlantic recently that basically said, boomers, the world isn't like it used to be, and that your kind of understanding of reality isn't the reality that the traditional college students that I come into contact with have experienced. I mean, their entire life, the internet has been there, and I can remember rotary phones. It's hard for me to say. It's really kind of a philosophical question.
Yeah. Now, one question is asking about the changes to the nature of work, such as the decline of family farms and the Rust Belt decline. And he was wondering if how that would affect politics.
Um, certainly, and again, this is a slide that I didn't use in this particular presentation. Uh, the nature of work in the United States has changed dramatically over the last 60 years, 50 years, whatever. Um, you know, Part of this is the decline in unionized work. It used to be with a high school education, you could get a pretty darn good job, provide for your family, have a boat, uh, and have a nice life. Uh, Now those jobs, according to one story, is they've been sent overseas. Actually, the data shows that they've been mechanized, that robots have taken over about 80% of the manufacturing jobs. And so certainly this is part of the sort of patchwork of changes that have taken place. We're overwhelmingly a service-based economy now. And if you're not at the knowledge worker level with a post graduate education, your service contribution is going to be in a menial kind of job. And so the nature of work is certainly a part of this story.
Yes, thank you. Someone asks, have you read Thomas Sowell's book, Conflict of Visions? It makes the case that there's a fundamental conflict of visions that plays out as disagreements on issues. Pardon me. Any new issue will uncover the conflict, so it will not create commonality. And he said, we saw that with COVID.
No, I did not see that. I have not read that book,
Okay,
but
sure.
it sounds interesting.
Sure. Another person asks, when did the Republican and Democratic parties switch their platforms from Republicans being for the people to being for the elite and vice versa?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the last part.
Sure. So they're saying that they switched platforms, that the Republicans used to be for the people and now they're for the elite. And when did that switch? I mean, I
Well,
think that I recall that Republican Party has said we're the party of Lincoln, which seems to be a switch from their current stance, I guess.
well, actually, I think the evidence shows that the parties have sort of switched their constituent base. It used to be that the Republicans emphasized their connection to Wall Street and to the country club Republicans I was talking about, where the Democrats were more the blue collar party. And now, over the last several election cycles, we've seen a shift where now people with higher education degrees are voting overwhelmingly for Democrats. It's still true that the wealthy generally break towards Republicans, but so do people with less than a college education, and people who, you know, it's there's this belief that the people who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020 are somehow the downtrodden of society. They're not. They're solidly middle class economically, average income about $70,000. And so both Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden did much better among those who are at the lower ends of the economic spectrum. So certainly there's been a switch in who Republican candidates attract and who Democrats attract. But I think it's more of a feature of this ongoing sort of populism that I talked about, and appeals to populism. People don't vote their pocketbooks. If they did, then people would be wondering why the Republicans are holding the debt crisis hostage when they voted in trillions of more deficit spending, when they controlled both the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And so a lot of times issues, even COVID, become symbolic, and they're symbols of hating the other side, not of, a coolly consideration of the facts of the case.
This has just been a wonderful presentation, Dr. Steer. I want to thank you so much. And I've learned a great deal. I can see comments coming through from people saying the same thing. We've reached our time limit, and I'm so sorry we haven't been able to answer all the questions that came through. I want to thank everyone in our audience for joining us tonight and submitting your questions. And I hope you enjoyed this program. You'll receive a very short audience survey tomorrow in your email, and that will help Humanities Washington continue offering programs like this one. You can see in the chat for more outstanding presentations from Humanities Washington. Please see their calendar of events. Again, this event will be recorded. It's being recorded as we speak. The recording will be available on Snow Owl's YouTube channel in 1 to 2 weeks. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good evening. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.